As tensions escalate in Cuba, the once steady foundation of communism quivers under the weight of discontent. Streets echo with protesters demanding change, while government forces stand poised for confrontation. In the shadows of crumbling buildings, whispers of dissent grow louder, fueled by years of suppressed frustration. The world watches as the fate of an ideology teeters on the edge of collapse. The future of Cuba and the trajectory of communism itself hang in the balance. Sky News Digital Originals presents Cuba in Crisis. We're witnessing a historic moment in Cuba where protests have erupted across the nation, signalling a significant shift in the political landscape.
So the Cuban people have taken to the streets once again last Sunday in Santiago de Cuba and also in other areas near Santiago. So hundreds of people took to the streets in response to electric power outages that are controlled by the state and the regime. Also, food crisis. In Cuba, there is very little food for the amount of millions of people that are on the island. And so Cubans, since July 11th, 2021, have began practicing once again at the stage of thousands of protesters, their activism. They've been engaging in rights that they don't have, but they've been demanding that they have a right to talk and to engage with each other and the public and the international community on their complaints with the current government, which is repression, which is silence, a lot of propaganda. And so the Cubans are out on the streets. Once again, it's getting hotter and hotter. It's almost, summer, and there's very little power. There's old technology that is somewhat comparable to old 1950s cars. And so you don't have an efficient electric system, and you have an electric system that's controlled by the state, that is at times weaponized by the state, just like food is weaponized by the state. So the economic conditions, I don't want your viewers to think it is something that is just happening naturally. No, this is something controlled internally by the Cuban regime. And most of the time it has to do with weaponizing both food and electricity so the people won't demand their human rights.
Yeah, protests aren't that well known in Cuba. I mean, they all sort of supported the revolution and didn't really protest and really weren't allowed to. I think the fact is that you are seeing open protests shows a bit like fall of the Soviet Union, that people prepare to go out in the streets means pretty dire. And also everyone's trying to get out. So, there was a view that if you left the revolution and you escaped, you were sort of a traitor. But now everyone's saying, well, if you can go, I would as well. So it's been the biggest exodus of Cubans trying to flee in some time. Cuba's in its worst state economically for 30 years. It's a bit of a combination. I think it's COVID, it's internal mismanagement, some decisions they've made internally sort of post the Castro brothers, and the sanctions. Obama, when he was president, was sort of trying to lift the sanctions and get Cuba more integrated with the Caribbean and the US and North America. And then Trump, sort of reimposed them on sort of terrorist grounds, and Biden hasn't lifted them. So the sort of, the smashing of Cuban tourism by COVID and the sanctions, and also just being too centrally planned in a 21st century economy, it's been like a terrible sort of confluence of three things coming together.
In Cuba's capital of Havana, the streets have been filled with demonstrators chanting slogans against the government. These protests, which began over economic hardships and government repression, have now evolved into a broader call for political reform. The people of Cuba are demanding change, and they're not backing down.
It's extremely dangerous. If you were to look at what happened to the protesters on July 11th, 2021, there was extreme repression by the state, and political prisoners, or what we call political prisoners of conscience. There are right now over 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba related to the July 11th, 2021 protests. But before July 11th, 2021, since Fidel Castro took power in 1959, we've had thousands of political prisoners. My father was one in the early 1960s He was a young Afro-Cuban youth who was against the regime. Him and a couple of buddies ran a bus into the American embassy, and they were put in prison. And he was repressed for many years until we were able to escape in the 1980s during the Mario boat lift. So Cuban people have been engaging, Cuban people across racial lines, because that's the other thing that people seem to forget, is that the Cuban regime is largely people who do not look like the Cuban people. The Cuban people are largely multiracial, of Afro-Cuban descent, and the people who are in power are not that. They're quite the color of the walls that you see behind me.
Well, they're trying to manage it behind the scenes without saying too much publicly, like most communist regimes do. I mean, Gil, ironically, was trying to bring in some private sector reforms to build up micro enterprises, which are pretty sparse in Cuba, and probably didn't go far enough with liberalisation. And of course, it comes to the difficulty we've now got with China, is that market liberalisation was meant to follow with some democratic liberalisation. And it looks like in Cuba that neither's happening. And so that's why people are desperately protesting. And when people leave, I mean, the Communist Party sees that as good, because they say there's less troublemakers around. You know, back when Jimmy Carter was president, he embraced all the Cubans trying to, go over to the Keys and on whatever boat they could. And Fidel Castro opened up all the jails and the mental hospitals and let them all go, because he saw it as a chance to get rid of the troublemakers. So I think they'd rather more exodus than more protests at home.
The regime is shaking right now because the Cuban people since 2021 en masse, right? The 2021 July 11th protests were across the entire island, coming out of the poorest neighborhoods. People took to the streets, young people, college students took to the streets. College students, young people are still in prison. Women, mothers are still in prison because they exercised their human right. So the Cuban regime knows the Cuban people are getting smarter and they're not afraid. You know why they're not afraid? Because they're hungry, and the hunger is pushing them past their fear. So when you get the Cuban people to that point, the regime is of course terrified and they are on the brink of collapse. And so they want to keep blaming the embargo, which has not been an issue, right? Because the biggest exporter of meat and chicken has been the United States, right? And the embargo does not control food on the island. That's the Cuban regime's job. They control everything that doesn't come to the Cuban people. Even humanitarian aid, when it's allowed, it's controlled by the Cuban regime. So that has been that discourse that is also tied to these economic critiques, is the embargo. It's not the embargo, and I think something like an analogy of an abusive husband, right? An abusive husband never thinks about the fact that they're an abuser. They're always blaming someone else. And that's exactly what the Cuban regime is doing now. But you know what? The Cuban people are rising up and they're standing against their abuser and they're calling it out. And the international community knows that, because this is a historic moment in Cuba.
In a bold move, Cuban artists and activists have united, urging the military to stand with the people. The collective effort seeks to amplify voices for change amid ongoing socio-political tensions. Their message underscores the call for solidarity and unity in the pursuit of a better future for Cuba.
It's extremely significant. One, let me just speak about celebrities. So the Cuban people have been engaging in these anti-government protests and pro-artist protests. So in 2018, the San Isidro artists, Michael Osorbo, Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, who are now in prison, have been pushing the regime and pushing the state to allow artists more freedoms. And so again, even before 2021, the San Isidro movement has been popular in rising up against the regime and being a symbol of freedom, through also the protest called Patria y Vida, which Afro-Cuban artists have also been leading with San Isidro. And so that is another piece when it comes to celebrities who have been leading that. But as far as the celebrities that have been engaging in talking specifically to the military, the strategy is that the military class and those under the military class are actually like the policemen, like those who are on the streets, are similar to the Cuban people, right? So they have maybe a little more privilege as far as maybe getting access to a little bit more food or a little bit more electricity than the actual Cuban people who are not a part of the state apparatus. So the celebrities are targeting them because they're not that much different than the Cuban people. And if they were to stop taking orders from the higher up military regime and actually side with the Cuban people, their brothers and sisters, the regime would fall. And that's the strategy with the celebrities.
To understand the roots of this crisis, we need to understand Cuba's history. For decades, the island nation has been under the rule of the Castro regime, which established a socialist system after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. While Cuba has made strides in healthcare and education, it's also faced severe economic challenges exacerbated by the collapse of the Soviet Union and decades of US economic sanctions.
The fact that this is a communist regime that was put into power by the Soviets in the 1930s. If we were to read this book called The Soviet Caribeño, which draws up Czech Republic documents, intelligence documents, documenting that Fidel Castro was chosen by the Soviets. Right? The Cuban people never chose Fidel Castro. And so this was a regime implemented by the Soviets to the Cuban people, and the Cuban exile community, the mass exodus, has been our key forms of expressing how we are not happy with this political system. We are against this totalitarian regime, and the political prisoners, the dissidents, the mass exodus. 500,000 Cubans fled Cuba since 2021. That is the largest exodus since when I arrived in the 1980s as a refugee. And we had 250,000 during the Mariel boat lift. And even the 90s with the Barcelo crisis. So we're voting with our feet, right? The fact that we can't vote, we're voting with our feet. The fact that we have exoduses to show that we don't want this regime. But the interesting conflict for Cuban people is that Cuban people also don't want to leave their home countries. Culturally, we want to be on the island, but economically, politically, socially, the Cuban people are being starved. I mean, this is also a part of Soviet, plans, starving the people. And that is what the regime has been doing. And that is something that's not talked about. The political connotations to the economic problems are not being talked about. And that's the main problem.
Post-Castro brothers, so, it's sort of a new generation, people who, for the first time, people who weren't involved in the revolution back in 1959 now. So it is this sort of new generation. I think you find with things like, South Africa post-Mandela, the next generation does struggle, I think, and the economy minister Gill had to resign, and a lot of ministers have been put under pressure because the Communist Party in Cuba is good at setting up scapegoats, but then the problems don't go away. So I think that's but there's a degree of political instability that we haven't seen in Cuba for a long time, when the Castros sort of had it by an iron grip.
Indeed, as the situation in Cuba unfolds, attention turns to the upcoming US presidential election and its potential implications for Cuban-American relations. Both major parties have historically taken different approaches to Cuba, with Republicans favouring a hardline stance and Democrats advocating for engagement and diplomacy.
The Biden administration has been critiqued by the Cuban exile community and those who are actually trying to find more ways for things to get even more difficult for the regime, and to tighten sanctions and to apply more sanctions. And so the Biden administration has been somewhat responsive after July 11th, 2021, but we have heard that they have been engaging in some talks about doing more with the Cuban regime as far as addressing the needs of the Cuban people. And so a lot of Cubans who tend to be Republican on this issue, Cuban Americans in exile, tend to be people who vote more conservatively because they grew up in a communist regime. And so this one issue tends to push them over, although they tend to be pretty liberal when it comes to issues domestically. But when it comes to foreign policy, it's tough, because when Trump was in office, he tightened, policy on Cuba, and, the Democrats and some people in Congress want to push Biden into, softening the Trump policies. But what I've heard is that, and what I've seen is that Biden has tried to remain neutral, but the Cuban exile community and the Cuban people with their protests have actually pushed him to not necessarily do more against the Trump administration policies. He's actually kept, Cuba on the terrorist list. The Cuban regime is still on the terrorist list, which is really important. But as far as remissions to Cuba, I know that the Biden administration is allowing up to $1,000, where before that wasn't the case, but they want to push Western Union. And the Cuban exile community, we do not want that. Actually, Cuban exiles are not sending money to Cuba. I'm not even sending money to my own family in Cuba because I know that the regime is going to get a percentage. And we don't want to fuel the regime in any way whatsoever. We want this regime to fall. So as far as who's going to represent more of the Cuban people's needs, it may seem like the Republican or Republican candidate, but in reality, we don't know if it's going to align largely with the political needs and the policy needs of an entire Cuban community that's multi-generational, that's also a bit liberal. But when it comes to Cuba policy, typically the Republicans are the ones that do a better job.
Well, they're probably a bit worried about Trump coming back because he's the one that imposed the sanctions on the grounds of terrorism. But the point is, though, that Biden didn't lift them. So they're in for a tough time either way. Perhaps Trump will be more outrageously anti-Cuba, but Biden won't be that much different. So the election's not really good for them. It may be if Biden gets back in, they try and do a deal to do some economic and political reforms at home in exchange for lifting the embargo, but it'd be a pretty brave bargain to make. And no one will do it before the election because, of course, the exiled Cubans are pretty important in Florida and Texas and in important states. So it's probably something for the president after the election, not before. Well, the sanctions made it very hard to invest in Cuba, so that held things up. The tourism industry got completely smashed by COVID. I mean, 4 million tourists suddenly gone. So that meant no tourists, no foreign exchange. Plus the people who want to invest in, Cuban tourism, back to the sort of heyday of you saw in the Godfather movies, how big casinos were in Cuba. That's dried up, and it's meant, their trading routes have been stuffed up, and they've had to get very expensive oil from Venezuela, a friendly country, and to some degree Mexico. So that's made it very, very hard for them. And of course, whichever way the presidential election goes, the sanctions are probably going to be in place for some time.
As the world watches the events unfolding in Cuba, one thing is clear. The future of the island nation hangs in the balance with both domestic and international factors shaping its path forward. Could communist Cuba be about to fall?